For 10,000 years, the rhythm of human life was dictated by the sun and the seasons. Tools were extensions of the human arm, and power was limited to the strength of a horse, the flow of a river, or the direction of the wind. A merchant in 1700 lived in a world fundamentally similar to that of a merchant in ancient Rome. Everything was hand-produced, local, and finite. But in the late 18th century, in the damp, mineral-rich landscape of Great Britain, that ancient rhythm began to break. Humans learned how to extract power from the earth itself and scale it beyond anything seen before. We call it the Industrial Revolution. Beginning around 1760, spreading to continental Europe and the United States, this event marked the transition from hand production to machines. It was the moment humanity unlocked the stored energy of millions of years and used it to drive the gears of a new civilization. In the mid-18th century, Great Britain was the leading commercial nation on Earth. It controlled a global empire stretching from the Caribbean to the Indian subcontinent. It was a nation of merchants, entrepreneurs, and thinkers. But more importantly, it was a nation sitting on a literal mountain of coal. This single resource, combined with an unprecedented entrepreneurial spirit, would spark a fire that would consume the old world and forge a new one. To understand how this revolution began, we must look at the 5 pillars of industrial supremacy that allowed Britain to outpace the rest of the world. First was high agricultural productivity. The British agricultural revolution had already begun using mechanical seed drills and iron plows to produce more food with fewer workers. This freed up a massive labor force that was now looking for work. Second was political stability and the rule of law. Unlike many of its neighbors, Britain had a legal system that protected property rights and encouraged the formation of joint stock companies. The third pillar was a geographic windfall. Britain was an island with extensive coastlines and navigable rivers, making transport easy. Fourth was the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which had created a culture of experimentation and discovery. And finally, there was the unique combination of high wages and cheap energy. In Britain, it was expensive to hire a man, but incredibly cheap to buy coal. This created a massive incentive to build machines that could do the work of humans. Before the factories, there was the putting out system. In small villages across Lancashire, families worked in their own homes. Women would spin raw wool or cotton into yarn, and men would weave that yarn into cloth on hand looms. It was a slow domestic life. But the demand for textiles was exploding. Britain had developed a taste for white gold. Initially, Britain could not compete with the delicate hand-woven fabrics coming from India. Indian labor was 5 times cheaper, and their quality was unmatched. The British government even passed the Calico Acts to protect domestic wool and linen from Indian imports. But instead of stopping the trade, these laws forced British entrepreneurs to innovate. They needed a way to make cotton cloth faster and cheaper than anyone else. The first domino fell in 1733 when John Kay invented the flying shuttle. The simple device doubled the output of a weaver, but it created an immediate crisis. There wasn't enough yarn to keep up with the looms. It took nearly 8 spinners to supply a single weaver. The imbalance remained a bottleneck for decades until James Hargreaves stepped forward with the spinning jenny. This wooden-framed machine allowed a single worker to spin multiple threads at once. It was small enough for a cottage, but it was the first step towards the factory. Then came Richard Arkwright, a man who nurtured inventors and protected his patents with a legal iron fist. He developed the water frame, a machine that was too large for a home and required the power of a rushing river. Arkwright built the world's first true cotton mill, proving that production was no longer a family affair. It was now an industrial process. Within a few years, Samuel Crompton combined the best of both machines into the spinning mule, which could produce thread finer and stronger than anything made by hand. The result was staggering. In 1750, Britain imported 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton. By 1850, that number had skyrocketed to 588 million. Manchester, once a modest town, earned the nickname Cottonopolis. It was a city of 900 factories, a place where the sky was permanently bruised by coal smoke and the air hummed with the sound of thousands of spindles. But as the cost of cloth fell, the human cost began to rise. The quality of hand-woven Indian cloth remained superior for decades. But British machines were so productive they eventually undersold Indian artisans, destroying an entire industry and leaving millions without work. While the textile mills were spinning the world's clothing, another revolution was happening underground. As coal mines grew deeper to meet the demand for fuel, they faced an enemy: water. Mines were constantly flooding, and traditional pumps were too weak to clear them. This necessity led to the birth of the steam engine. At the turn of the 18th century, Thomas Newcomen introduced the first successful piston steam engine. These were massive, hulking machines that sat at the mouth of mine shafts. They were incredibly inefficient by modern standards, wasting massive amounts of energy. But because coal was cheap at the mine, it didn't matter. They opened up a great expansion in mining, allowing workers to go deeper into the earth than ever before. The true turning point came when a Scotsman named James Watt realized that the Newcomen engine was cooling its cylinder during every stroke, which was a massive waste of steam. Supported by his business partner Matthew Boulton, Watt perfected an engine that used a separate condenser. The single innovation increased efficiency so much that his engines used only a fraction of the coal required by older models. By the time the Watt engine had been fully developed into a rotative type, it could be used to directly drive the machinery of a factory. For the first time in history, mankind was no longer dependent on the wind, the tide, or the muscle of an animal. A factory could be built anywhere, not just next to a river. Steam was applied to everything. It blew the bellows of blast furnaces, it hammered iron, and it drove the looms. The invisible army of mechanical workers was growing by the thousands of horsepower every year. Steam also transformed the iron industry. For centuries, iron had been smelted using charcoal, which meant the industry was limited by the available wood. But earlier breakthroughs by the Darby family had shown that coke, a purified form of coal, could fuel blast furnaces. This allowed for much larger furnaces and an explosion in production. As cast iron became cheaper and more available, it became a primary structural material. A famous early example is the Iron Bridge, a structure that signaled to the planet that a new material had arrived. New manufacturing processes, such as puddling and rolling, allowed for the production of structural iron at a fraction of the previous cost. Puddling was backbreaking, dangerous work. Few lived to see their 40th year, but their labor built the bridges, the factories, and eventually the railways that would knit the world together. As the factories grew, the landscape of Britain changed forever. This was the era of massive urbanization. In 1800, only 3% of the human population lived in cities. By the end of the century, that number was approaching 50%. People flooded in from the countryside, pushed by the enclosure of common lands, and pulled by the promise of steady wages in the mills. Manchester was the template for this new world. Its population exploded from 10,000 in 1717 to over 2.3 million by the early 20th century. But this growth was chaotic and unplanned because people moved in so rapidly. There was not enough capital to build adequate housing. Families were squeezed into overcrowded slums, living in shanties with dirt floors and no sanitary facilities. Friedrich Engels, in his observations of the English working class, described the back streets of Manchester as a stony desert. He saw rivers turned green by chemical waste and raw sewage. The stench of progress was a reality of daily life. Clean water was a luxury, and diseases like cholera and typhoid were endemic. In the mid-19th century, life expectancy in these industrial centers plummeted. In some districts, more than half of all children died before the age of 5. Inside the factories, a new kind of discipline was enforced. In the rural world, work followed the sun and the seasons. In the factory, work followed the clock. The factory system demanded that humans adapt to the pace of the machines. Shifts lasted 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. Most of the workers in the early textile mills were unmarried women and children. Child labor was not new, but the industrial system made it more visible and more grueling. Children as young as 8 were employed as scavengers, crawling under moving machinery to pick up loose cotton, or as piecers who stepped into the frames to repair broken threads. They were paid a fraction of an adult's wage, sometimes only 10%, and were often preferred because they were small and easier to manage. This created a profound social crisis, leading to the first general laws against child labor, the Factory Acts, which eventually limited the working day and began the slow process of moving children from the factory floor to the schoolroom. Yet, despite the hardship, the Industrial Revolution also created a massive new middle class. For the first time, there was a growing population of businessmen, clerks, foremen, and engineers. These people lived in comfortable homes with carpets, mirrors, and the latest consumer goods. They were the drivers of a consumer revolution, where luxury items like sugar, tea, coffee, and fine Wedgwood china became affordable for the new urban elite.